Matthew Goldberg, the chair of the Cebu Training Member Engagement Committee and a consumer banking reporter at Bankrate. On behalf of Cebu, welcome to today's webinar on covering the Fed a year into rate increases. We have a great moderator and panel here today for this very timely webinar. Our moderator today is Mark Hamrick, Washington Bureau Chief and Senior Economic Analyst at Bankrate. Joining us as panelists today are Jonnelle Marte, Federal Reserve reporter at Bloomberg, Colby Smith, U.S. Economics editor at the Financial Times, and Nick Timiraos, Chief Economics correspondent at the Wall Street Journal. To our listeners, if you have a question for the panel, please post it in the Zoom chat. Biographies of our moderator and panelists are at cebu.org. With that, I'll hand things over to former Cebu president, Mark Hamrick. Mark?
Thanks so much, Matt. Great to see everybody. We know we had some strong response in the sense of registration, and I guess to some degree the news cycle, unfortunately or fortunately, has helped us out a little bit, given the gravity of the events of the past week. A couple of program notes. First of all, Matt is a Cebu board member as well as a great colleague at Bankrate of mine. I want to remind you that this is coming to you by way of Cebu, which is the leading association of business and financial journalists. And as we sort of get back to quote unquote normal after the pandemic, Cebu has a conference coming up. It'll be in St. Petersburg, Florida, April 20th through the 22nd. So please consider, if you haven't already, registering for that. And you can find out more information about the conference as well as ongoing webinars and learning opportunities at cebu.org. And a more timely note is that if you want to take advantage of the early bird registration at the conference hotel, that early bird rate is available only today and tomorrow, and then you'll pay the higher freight. So with that in mind, I want to welcome our panelists we're sort of evenly divided from the Washington, D.C. and New York areas, which isn't dissimilar from the distribution of financial press. And as Matt said, we do ask that you consider, if you have a question, putting that into the chat. And the way we're planning to do this, and by the way, this is recorded, that this will run about an hour. And I'm going to guide some Q&A here at the beginning, and rather than probably going back and forth between myself and the participants, I'll guide some of the questions here in the beginning, and then we'll get to your questions, depending on the volume of those that come in the second half of the hour. So with that, before we jump right into the news cycle, let's talk a little about the reporting process. And how each of you do that job and what the experience is like. And we're mindful that we have some people who are college students and interns joining us, as well as some people who are more senior. So we're grateful for that, but also mindful that we have a range of experiences in the sense of those who are joining us, including some who have not been knee deep or hip deep or whatever would be, sometimes feeling like we're underwater, trying to cover what's going on with the Federal Reserve. So the question I'll ask, and we'll begin with Colby, could you just speak briefly about how you see your role in your job, Colby? And that also includes the audience and how you think your beat is defined. And I'd say on this first question, everybody could think about maybe 60 seconds. That would be great.
Sure, happy to, and thank you for having me. So writing for the Financial Times, it really means our audience is quite global. The FT is based in the UK, so in my role, a key component of that is translating, what the Fed is doing and fluctuations in the US economy and what that means on a kind of more broad global scale. Now, it helps that the Fed's policy actions have quite a big impact on global financial markets and the economies more broadly. So it's not too tough of a sell at the FT in particular, but that's usually the kind of angle with which we kind of approach various stories about the Fed. Now, in terms of the FT's audience, it's typically, chief executives, government officials, investment professionals, things like that. But in this position, I think what's kind of critical is translating some of the things that the Fed does that might not be, so well known to everyday readers, and trying to kind of present that in the clearest way possible, using the least amount of jargon. So even though our audience is are people who, understand a basis point or understand some of these other more technical terms, the kind of onus is on us to kind of translate some of these topics into more layman's terms. So it's been a fun time to be covering the Fed, to say the least, and it's certainly getting more and more kind of traction as the current events kind of entail. But you really kind of work well with a global audience, and that's our kind of approach here, and it's been a lot of fun.
Thank you. Jonnelle, you want to tackle that question in about 60 seconds?
So similar to what Colby mentioned, our audience at Bloomberg is very informed. So a lot of the people might be investors or hedge fund managers, economists, of course, policymakers. So we write for them, and we follow very closely, the changing sentiment from policymakers, what the messages that they're sending, what they're doing to manage, inflation in the economy. But part of the job is also just capturing what's happening in the economy. And that really looks at, well, what's it like for home buyers? What's it like for people who are trying to find jobs right now? Buy a car, get access to credit. And so I think of my job as, having those two main components. So following policy and writing for the kind of investors and institutional readers, but also just writing for like my family, for my friends about what's going on in the world right now, what's going on in the economy, and what that looks like.
Thank you. Nick, same question in about 60 seconds, if you will.
Sure. I see the job as really having three pieces to it. We're covering the economy, we're covering finance, and we're covering policy and politics. And on any day, you can pick off one of those things. You might write about all of those things. And so it's a really enriching and rewarding beat, because it's not just about what the next interest rate decision is going to be, even though that's what one segment of our readers are, of course, interested in. And like Colby and Jonnelle, I think the challenge for us, the opportunity and the challenge is, there are a group of people that are highly interested in everything the Fed says, and they don't need to be explained why the minutes of the Fed meeting are important and what certain, Fed speak buzzwords mean. But then, even at the Wall Street Journal, which I think people regard as a fairly, finance sophisticated audience, our readers are really from across the country: business owners, students, retirees, and people who don't follow the Fed, and they're intimidated by it and mystified by it. And so our job is, in one story, to reach that highly technical audience that really wants, to be maybe more in the weeds, but to not leave behind the retiree in Long Beach, California, who's just trying to figure out what's happening with the economy.
So Nick, I'm going to follow up with you and then ask our other participants to ask the same question, because it just occurred to me it's an incredibly relevant question, particularly when talking about the Fed. I think all four of us have the benefit of living in fabulous areas, meaning the Washington and New York areas. But we know that in the past, journalism in general has not always done a great job understanding the experience and the realities of people far, far away from where we toil. So as you just referenced, those important members of your audience, how do you try to be attentive to the experience of the person who may not understand why the Fed left rates at record low levels and they didn't get return on their savings that they would have liked, or felt like they have been marginalized by globalization or innovation and technology? How do you dial into those people, or at least try to be mindful in your writing and your reporting?
Yeah, it's very difficult, and it's important for us to do all of those things. I think one of the challenges with covering the Fed is the decisions are fairly binary. You raise rates, or you hold them steady, or you lower them. The counterfactuals are unknowable. Well, this is what would have happened if they hadn't taken this policy course. We can't prove it. I think sometimes, so to the specific point you raised about, well, the Fed left interest rates so low from 2009 on, You can look at other countries. I mean, there are central banks in other countries that move policy differently. Sometimes the ECB raised interest rates in 2011 or 2012, and then there was a banking crisis and they had to cut interest rates even lower, and they had so sometimes I think we can bring the global experience to bear in terms of highlighting the counterfactual. Well, here's a jurisdiction that did something different with policy, and actually, higher interest rates didn't make things better. But it's hard to do these things, so I guess that's how I would answer it.
Okay, either Colby or Jonnelle, you want to take a swing at that one?
As Jonnelle mentioned, I mean, I think a big aspect of this job is covering both the real economy as well as some of these policy decisions. So I feel like in a lot of ways, it's we're beholden to having to go travel, speak to people whose, livelihoods are changed by Fed decisions. And that means getting out of DC, getting out of New York, and actually, talking to people who, run a restaurant. I remember doing a piece about the labor market shortage. The Fed kind of talked again and again. I mean, they're still talking about this very tight labor market, but seeing it in action by talking to someone in Atlanta who's been trying to get back to a more normal schedule in terms of running their restaurant but can't find workers, it just kind of brings the issue to light a little bit in a more tangible way. So I think it's really about, for us, marrying the policy type pieces alongside, more real economy focused stories, and combined, it helps to give a more kind of fulsome picture of the U.S. economy.
And to add to that, I try in every story that I do that is, more about the workforce or businesses, to include voices from all around the country, so that I'm not concentrating in any one region unless it's a story about that region. But I try to find home buyers on the West Coast, on the East Coast, South, North, etc., and to try to show how things might be different. Also, having that perspective informs me in terms of how people are thinking about these things that I have to write about, and that might, like Nick said, get in more into the weeds about the policy sometimes. So having those conversations with home buyers, with people trying to find a place to live or rent or whatever it is, helps. But basically the bottom line is trying to get diverse voices. And even when it comes to, experts that we talk to, trying to have a range of perspectives of people from different backgrounds. I could always be better at it, but I try. And I think that helps.
Thank you all. Let me ask you about what an average day might be like. If that's too short of a time span, how you view the process of what you do. And along with that, I want to ask how you decide what you'll be working on, whether it's a collaborative process, how much push and pull do you have in that situation? I'll start again with you, Jonnelle.
So, it really varies. That's one of the nice things about this job is that, not only the kinds of stories that you do can be so different, but every day is different. So, I mean, let's say maybe I'll give you like a few days or so, but part of the job is covering the Fed officials when they're talking. And so that, one aspect is heading to these events, traveling if there's not going to be a virtual option, which, sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. So traveling a bit just to watch them speak, listen to them. Of course, trying to set up those interviews. And then when I'm not like following, policy decision or Fed speak, it's reading economic reports, going through the data, and setting up calls depending on the story that I'm working on, with economists and with trying to find either the workers or the business owners, et cetera, for the story that I'm working on. So I find it to be a nice mix of those two things in my experience.
Colby, I'm going to ask you to address that same question, and also perhaps how your process might be the same or different, but also whether it's reset to pre-pandemic norms, and also whether it's really sort of a 24/7, 365 gig.
So definitely, I mean, after this week in particular, 24/7, 365. But just in terms of the kind of the process itself, I mean, we're kind of ruled by a schedule. So we have the set Fed meetings, we have the Fed minutes that come out, you know, a couple weeks after those meetings. We have the jobs report, the inflation report. In a way, it's a blessing and a curse. You kind of know when you're going to be really, really busy, and you know when you have a little bit more time to maybe do a more reflective piece that's a little bit more deeply reported. But it never really changes, and you kind of like get the schedule kind of in the beginning, I guess the end of the previous year, early on in this next year, and you kind of know, okay, well, can't go on vacation there, or I better be around for this. But it does mean that there is kind of consistency. So you know when things get a little bit hectic. But then you get a situation like this past week where I don't want to speak for everyone else, but I imagine they were in a similar situation where they're working essentially the entire weekend to try to make sense of the banking crisis. And it's kind of in those moments where, you know, it's on the one hand, you know, completely and totally exhausting, but it's also really exhilarating. And you realize that there are, you know, these are really kind of historic moments. And this weekend was no exception.
Nick, same question.
Yeah, I agree with what both panelists said, in particular Colby's point about the schedule. I mean, we know when the meetings are, you know, there's going to be news around those meetings. It's a little bit like covering the playoffs, you know, that whatever happens, especially, you know, where we're in this environment where the Fed has been making large moves. It's not like they're just holding rates at zero forever right now. So, so you know when those are coming, you can plan for them. And, you know, usually what I try to do is think about, all right, what are going to be the key debates animating the policy discussion about the economy, about, you know, what are the trends that are on either side of the debate. And so in the run up to the meeting, I'm thinking about stories that can help audiences understand why they're making the decisions that they're making, or what the risks are of making, you know, this decision versus that decision. And then you get to the news event itself, and it's fairly easy. It's like showing up to cover the playoff game, like I said. And then, you know, the other part, I think, is just preparing for the unexpected, like what we're going through right now. And so there is no traditional day. I mean, ideally, we're breaking, you know, news of analysis, traditional scoops, and accountability stories. And you're trying to make sure that you're always, you know, balancing those objectives.
Thank you all. We have a couple of questions from the audience. I'm going to hold off on those right now, but I do promise to get to those. If anybody else has some to add there. Nick, there was a fascinating piece that was written about you in New York Magazine, where it referenced some of the laudatory credits that I think come your way, including you might comment on how you feel about it, sort of a nickname, the Fed Whisperer, where you've broken a lot of news, including setting up I think it was the June FOMC meeting, where we were not prepared for a large rate hike of 75 basis points, and you broke that news with a source from the Fed. Is that both sort of a blessing and a curse? How do you feel about that level of responsibility? And if there's anything that you can tell us about how that process works, I'm sure we'd be interested to hear it.
So I've been at the Journal for 17 years now. I've been covering the Fed for the last 6. I don't feel like my job has changed at all in the last 6 years. I'm trying to do the same thing that everybody else is doing. And, you know, there's I guess, attention on the outside, but it doesn't affect in any way what I'm trying to do, which, as I said, is to break news of analysis, traditional scoops, and accountability stories. You know, whatever publicity is, you I try to be not seen and not heard. I'm a print reporter. I didn't go into this for the vanity. So it's a little bit strange to me, I guess, that there's some of that attention, but it's also maybe an occupational hazard of writing about this for the Wall Street Journal, which has always cared a lot about what the Fed is doing, and our readers do too.
Well said. And I think just for context, for those who may not have read that article, and I would recommend it, I think one of your predecessors, David Wessel, basically said that goes along with the job at the Journal, right? So, but nevertheless, I'm sure it makes for interesting work. Colby, how do you treat this question of trying to break news on an institution which tries to be very careful about managing its messaging, but yet trying to nuance the coverage? And ultimately, I think a goal of everyone is try to provide content that is somewhat different.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thankfully, some of the Fed kind of presidents and officials kind of help out in that process by being so kind of public facing in their roles. And I think over the past couple of years, we've really seen, the various regional presidents, governors just speaking at a much more frequent clip than we did in the past. So as Nick said, the kind of focus is more on we call them at the FT like scoops of interpretation, like a different analytical bent to a current issue or a policy decision that's being made. But thankfully, you don't have to necessarily go too far to hear from the decision makers themselves directly. I think it's kind of, if you look at any kind of intermeeting period, it's kind of remarkable how often these officials make themselves available. And you can formulate there is sometimes a very clear message that many people are trying to send. And we've seen that a little bit more just, I think, in the last year when these rate decisions have been so consequential in terms of what they're doing to fight inflation. So you can hear, some of the same words being used or turns of phrase about, sufficiently restrictive is something that comes to mind, or being humble and nimble. I mean, these are words that once, the chair says, we hear it from a lot of other Fed officials as well. But it's about kind of looking past whatever the main message is and trying to unpack, reaction function. How does this one president view incoming data and how that will impact their decision themselves? And also how to kind of weight amongst all of the officials that you hear from, who is perhaps more influential, who's a voting member on the FOMC this year, because that changes every year. So I think part of this job is really understanding kind of the internal dynamics of the Fed to know who to kind of be paying attention to and where the real message is coming from. And it's kind of our responsibility to know that. And I think that's the way that we try to break ground about a Fed debate, let's say.
Jonnelle, anything to add there?
Not really. I mean, I would echo what they said. It's really important to for our readers just to try to explain as best as we can, especially when data comes out, how this is likely to affect policy based on what we've interpreted in terms of what we've heard from officials, how they're going to interpret that policy. And like Colby said, trying to highlight the most influential officials, knowing who they are, and it changes in any moment, and just trying to highlight maybe where they're coming from and how they're thinking about it.
Colby, you referenced sort of leveraging the different participants at the FOMC and the presidents of the various regional banks. Peter Coy asked a question, which I think is about trying to decide how to also highlight different points of view. What are the pluses and minuses of being the so-called, as he used the word, conduit for Fed messages to the markets, including when they may be looking to test the water, for example, on a message, so to speak?
I think what's important there is being as kind of comprehensive as you can about whatever message is being sent. Oftentimes when we're writing stories, it's easy to kind of boil down, let's say a certain viewpoint to a headline or a very like easy, more clickbaity type of view. But I think something that has helped, and I know the Wall Street Journal does this as well, where we'll publish the entire transcript, let's say, of an interview. So it's not, yes, we are asking the questions and directing the conversation, but you're not just strictly seeing, the quotes and the details that we can fit into what is often a pretty kind of constrained word count. I mean, at the FT, we're working with like 800 to 1200 words. That's not a lot to be able to kind of have a fully formed, to reflect a fully formed view of a Fed president. So, and we've realized that like in this current moment where some of these rate decisions are so kind of up in the air to a certain extent, or the data really is impacting, is having a more immediate impact on how much the Fed really thinks it needs to do. I think the onus is on us to make sure that those comments are being kind of reflected in the most accurate way possible. And I guess I'm just thinking mostly of, when Fed officials often say, they're open to any option. And it's important to know that like, that literally means every option, a pause, a cut, a hike. It doesn't necessarily mean like they're setting the stage for a big move, let's say, or a smaller move or anything like that. Like it's, and it's making sure that we make it clear that they have a more nuanced view than I think you can sometimes see when you just read the headline.
For sure. That's where the translation part absolutely comes in, what they are saying and what they are not saying. So a different flavor of that same question, Nick, given the importance of the jobs that all of you have, and then obviously by extension, the job you have, there is needing to manage those sources so that you can have a constructive relationship that allows you to do your job well for your enterprise as well as your audience. But there's also the part where you have to ask the tough questions, and I know that you're no stranger to doing that at news conferences. These news conferences began in 2011. Fed didn't always hold news conferences. I can tell you before the Fed held news conferences, obviously there were public speeches. This is for our audience. Where officials would appear. They would hold off the record background meetings with journalists. But the news conference thing is a whole different ballgame since 2011, after the great financial crisis, begun by under Ben Bernanke, but also with a push by Janet Yellen, who was vice chair of their communications committee at the time. So they have learned that sometimes an effort to be more transparent can also cause some challenges for them. So Nick, how do you not rupture that relationship if you ask the most searing question at a news conference, or is it your sense that all the people who are on the other side of the podium, so to speak, understand that's part of the job?
Yeah, I think they do understand that's part of the job. I think, a couple points I'd make is one, there's a challenge. I think the challenge for us, and maybe Peter's question was getting at this. I mean, I think the people who cover the Fed have a very sharp understanding of how this institution works. And sometimes I think if you don't understand so well how the institution works, then you might want the questions to go in a different direction. And it's because I think, so when I'm preparing for a press conference, I'm thinking about what I can ask that actually produces valuable information about how the Fed is thinking about what they're doing, and information that can serve the broadest section of interested people as possible. If, for example, you think that the Fed is very political and they're making their decisions based on electoral considerations, then you would probably, you might want the reporters in there to ask questions in a different way. I think if you've followed the Fed for some time and you understand that, yes, I mean, everybody has opinions and they're ideological people, but this is an institution that really does try to turn off a partisan filter to the extent that they're able. it changed. So my point is, once you begin to sort of understand how the institution works, it provides a huge strength, because I think you're able to sharpen your lines of inquiry, but it can also maybe you start to filter things out too. And so I think there's benefit from having other people in the newsroom who can bring a different perspective. But I think a lot of the times the frustration I hear from people is, well, why didn't you ask this? And oftentimes the reason we didn't ask that question is because Powell's been asked that question 10 times and he's answered it the same way 10 times. And reporters who get to ask one question at a news conference don't want to just invite him to give the talking point that he's repeated the 10 times he's been asked that question. So sometimes I think there's a challenge we have, because it looks like, well, you're not asking this or that. And it's because we actually pay so much attention, I think, to what they're doing, that there's a kind of, for me, a highly filtered process. The other thing I'd say is there's just a huge, I mean, the point you were making about the press conferences and this communications revolution that central banks have gone through. I mean, if I had covered the Fed 30 years ago, I wouldn't recognize what, I think 30 years ago, 40 years ago, Fed reporters were trying to write what had happened at the last meeting after the meeting, because they didn't tell anybody what had happened. So you were actually trying to break the story of what the decision had been. Now there is so much information. There's Fed presidents talking constantly. There's the minutes, there are transcripts, and you can go read the transcripts of the meetings from 5 or 6 years ago. And so you can really begin to develop a pretty comprehensive understanding of, where all these people are on sort of the policy spectrum. And then anytime they begin to change their message, for me, somebody who's been more hawkish and then they turn dovish, or somebody who's been more dovish, someone who prefers easier monetary policy, now saying, actually, we need to get tighter. Those sorts of inflection points, because you've been following the thing so incrementally and closely, you take signal from that, and it helps you sort of put more analysis into what's happening.
Jonnelle, I'm going to ask you a different way of coming at that question, which very well stated. Thank you, Nick. How much do you feel like you need to ask the question that your audience or readers want you to ask, as opposed to asking the question that might be top of mind to drive the next headline?
I guess the way we think about what question we're going to ask is how, to Nick's point, how do we get them to actually reveal something to us about their, I don't know if you want to call it their reaction function, or just how they are going to analyze, or how they are analyzing what's happening right now.
Can you explain for the audience that isn't covering the Fed what a reaction function?
Yeah, well, I don't know if what I mean by that is, okay, we're all watching the economic data that Colby, kind of listed, right? What's happening in the jobs market, what's happening with inflation, housing, purchases, construction, and all of that data comes together just to get a sense of how strong is the economy right now, how easy is it to get a job if you want one, how quickly are prices rising, and how bad is inflation. And then once you try to assess that, then you're trying to figure out, well, how do these policymakers take all of that into account, and how does it influence what they think needs to be done right now to accomplish their goals of keeping inflation under control and of making it so that anyone who wants a job can get one. And so we want to learn to think the way that they think, so that we can try to figure out, or at least explain to people what's at stake, and what that means for borrowing costs, what that could mean for the job market. So I try to ask questions that will offer insight into that. And then, when a mistake is made, we do have an accountability component to our job. And so we also have to ask in those moments, what are you going to do about it so that this doesn't happen again? How did that lapse? How was that allowed? And see, sometimes they will, maybe offer some insight on how they're responding But and it's not just what they say, it's also like us trying to figure out where are the conflicts, when they what are the conflicts and why does it matter, and doing the reporting to bring that to light.
Colby, you want to take a short run at that?
Sure. I mean, just on the questions themselves, what's been remarkable over the last year is just how much interest there is in what the Fed is doing, which I think speaks to what an uncertain time it is and how big, of an inflation shock we're dealing with, how that affects people all across the country. So what I found really interesting is that even approaching some of these questions, you're not necessarily having to make a binary choice between what you yourself is interested in versus what makes, let's say, a good headline. There's just been like a couple of topics that have been so kind of front and center that at every meeting, everyone's trying to understand some version of what more do you have to do and when will you know you've done enough. And so that kind of helps to, I think, for all of us, we always get back to what are the policy implications of whatever economic developments there are. And frankly, I think that's what readers are really drawn to. I mean, we talk a lot about, the incremental, are they going to do 25? Are they going to do 50? Are they going to do 75? And that can be a tiresome kind of conversation to have again and again, but it's also been like one of the most interesting aspects of this tightening cycle. I mean, they used speed in a way that they haven't in past experiences because they didn't need to, and they could just do kind of traditional quarter point moves. But it became, a really key aspect of the story. So for us, it became a key part of our line of questioning at these press conferences. But I agree, you kind of know, you have to frame the question in a way that you think you're going to get the most out of it. So whether that's incorporating the talking point in your question, so you kind of like remove the answer ahead of time, so you kind of break new ground is one way to do it. Or come at it from like a different angle altogether. But that's kind of part of the challenge and the fun every 6 weeks or so.
So one of the follow-ups that Peter asked was sort of asking about sort of the relationship between officials and you all. I'm going to come at that another way as well, and maybe only. Well, we'll see if all of you have a reply to this. Have you ever gotten any brushback from either a piece you've written or a question asked at a news conference from somebody on the Fed team? And if so, how did you manage that, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get in too far in the weeds on this, but sure. I mean, of course, people push back against stories that we write. I don't think any journalist has been involved in a story where somebody didn't like something that the journalist wrote. In terms of questions, I mean, I think people in these jobs recognize it's our job to ask questions, and they are, grown up, intelligent people who know how to answer them. And if they think it's a dumb question, I don't know. I haven't really, I guess what I'd say is we benefit, Fed reporters benefit from the fact that there are so many people out there who are either, there's 12 Reserve Bank presidents, right? I should have said that from the start for people who don't follow the Fed. So there's 12 Reserve Bank presidents. Right now there are 6 governors. There are as many as 7 governors. That's a lot of people. I mean, that's a lot of potential sources. It's a lot of, and then they have staffs at the reserve banks. And then you have, a lot of former Fed officials. And these former officials, because as I was talking earlier, this is an institution that has a very sort of strong culture. They think a certain way. There's sort of a Fed way about the institution. And the people who have worked there, a lot of them, even if they've left, they've internalized that. So even though former vice chairs of the Fed are not sitting at the policy table now, they can tell you how they would have approached it if they had faced that same problem. And more often than not, their analysis is pretty close to what ends up happening. So I think over time, you sort of begin to figure out that there are many different ways to get traction into this institution. And because of that, it maybe makes the the role of the PR people not as not the way that not as important as you might think it is, just because there's a lot of different ways into this. And then finally, because of that communications revolution inside central banks, I think to some extent they depend on the press understanding what it is they're doing to a greater degree than would be the case if it was just all a huge secret and we're going to be opaque and we're never going to explain and we're never going to, the fact that they're communicating more means that the press actually has a more powerful, perhaps, position than you might expect.
Oh, that's a good point, Colby. I'm just thinking, there's both the adversarial aspect of the job, but there's also the part where your job is to translate what the Fed is doing, which is something they need for you to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't necessarily, our job is to make clear what they are doing. And the facility, I think over the weekend on Sunday, that the bank lending facility was a kind of a key, is a really good example of this. It kind of takes you back to like the COVID emergency shock days, where every couple of days, even some hours, they're rolling out these new facilities. If you looked at them and the term sheets and the FAQs, it's like complete jargon heavy acronyms. We did a lot of stories on this, and we would just summarize it as like the alphabet soup of emergency measures. But part of that was, I think what made them so effective was everyone knowing through, I think, some of our work, why they were so effective. What was the Fed trying to do here? And I think the onus was on us to really kind of explain that in a way. And the same was true on Sunday when that news came. That announcement went a really far way in stabilizing a situation. And that's not because, the Fed put on its website a press release that says it's created this new lending facility, but it's because we all, actually interpreted what they were doing, put the information out there and put it out in a way that was kind of understandable. So you knew that this wasn't just any old lending facility, that they were going to have these special, more flexible terms. That's going to mean that it has a broader reach than otherwise. So I think, there is this translation aspect is kind of more important than I think we ever really recognize, especially in these kind of crisis moments. And I think in a lot of ways, it's a lot of the work that we're doing to make that quite clear, that does allow people to understand, what a big deal it was this weekend for what they did.
Yeah, absolutely. Jonnelle, anything to add there?
No, not really.
Okay, fair enough. This is a very specific question, which I may broaden out. One of our attendees, and also remind people that you can drop a question in the chat here in the Zoom environment, and we'll try to get to that. One of the questions is asking, and maybe I'll just throw this to anybody that wants to handle it. What is the impact of the 450 basis points in tightening we've had over the year had, essentially with respect to consumers' ability to purchase automobiles, and probably more broadly anything that would be about the trajectory of auto sales? Anybody want to handle that one?
I can step in. I think one of the things that's helpful for me in covering the Fed is remembering that these interest rate sensitive sectors are the sort of the front lines of where Fed policy works. I used to cover before this the mortgage market, and so having sort of a different way into this can be a useful, just you understand, like having covered the housing industry for 5 years, I understand why so many people care about what it is the Fed's doing. And the same thing is true for cars. I think what's happened with cars is interesting because there have been these chip shortages, and the supply bottlenecks mean that inventories have been very low. Normally, when the Fed raises interest rates this much, you would see a big pullback in auto demand. But because some very popular models, fuel-efficient models, haven't been able to be purchased, you sort of have this weird reservoir of pent-up demand. And one of the questions up until recently has been, well, the Fed raised rates so much, why aren't we seeing more of the impact. And I think you get into some of these pandemic related bottlenecks, chip shortages or other shortages, production getting shut down for however many weeks in 2020. And you can start to see that there are things that are interfering actually with the normal transmission mechanism of monetary policy. And so, if you don't cover the Fed, but you do cover an industry, your industry may actually be able to offer stories on what, well, here's one reason why, even though the Fed has raised rates so much, you're not seeing the impact right now. And one other somewhat unrelated point, but I'd make, if you're a econ or business reporter, but you're not covering the Fed, the 12 reserve banks of the Fed system, they produce a ton of really high quality research on all sorts of things. So, I covered political campaigns once, and I didn't know very much about the regional economy that we were parachuting into for wherever the election was going to be. And the regional Fed just has a really good sort of basic primer on here's unemployment, GDP, in this geography. And so I would say, never forget that if you're sort of just trying to get up to speed on something, you're looking for a story idea, you don't cover the Fed, you might think, well, what does the St. Louis Fed have to offer? You can spend some time in the research vaults of these websites, and there are story ideas alone in the research papers that they're being produced, and some of them are quite readable. They're not just some of them are fairly wonky, but they do try to present to a audience that doesn't have a PhD in econ.
I want to highlight what you were just referencing there, Nick, for people who haven't perhaps covered the Fed at all, or maybe just beginning in their careers to cover the economy is, they're one of the benefits of being on a beat like this is to be able to sort of learn on the job every day. And so, that's something all of us have to do, especially in a time like this. It's like, oh, what was Silicon Valley Bank? Why was it unique? Why is this special facility that regulators trotted out over the weekend important? What, how does it actually work, and how is that providing an advantage that they didn't have before? And so when you're going back and forth with experts, whoever they may be, maybe it's a local university professor who pays a lot of attention to these kinds of things, feel free to ask them, not only for what we would think of in broadcast as the soundbite, but just to say, I'm not that familiar with this, so can you explain this to me? And that's one of the benefits of being a journalist is, and Lord knows I've had to lean on this numerous times, both professionally and personally. My family would say all too often, don't be afraid to ask the stupid question, right? And you are given license to ask that. Just don't be stupid when you ask it. I mean, that's the difference, is you ask, and you can boil that down to the lowest level to say, why should anybody at home care about what the Fed is doing? Those are ultimately the questions that everybody's trying to get to. So I think that's all great. I'm going to ask you all three to answer this question sort of more in a lightning round fashion. What's the best thing about your job, and what's the worst thing about your job? Colby, I'm going to go to you first on that.
Well, I feel like you're inspiring my answer, because I think the best part is that you can call anyone up and be like, I don't understand this, and I'm curious, how you're thinking about something. And 9 times out of 10, people are willing to pick up the phone and explain something to you. So it's never boring, to say the least. You're always learning something new and kind of getting thrown into different crises and whatnot. And suddenly, after the repo crisis in 2019, you're like, okay, like maybe I understand plumbing a little bit better, and I wouldn't have had this not happen. So it just really can be a very exciting job. The worst part right now has just been, I think, the relentless pace of it. I don't know if any of us have really recovered from kind of covering the COVID response or anything like that, but I think everyone was hoping, like, once the emergency facilities were out of the way, things would stabilize. But then we got, the inflation shock, the rate hikes, now a banking crisis. So it's really been just absurdly busy. So it's more kind of a stamina thing more than anything else at this point.
Jonnelle, you want to take a quick stab at both those, best thing, worst thing?
So I think one of the best things about covering the Fed is that the story keeps changing. I've only been doing this since the end of 2019, but I mean, in that time frame, I've had, at first it was, why is inflation so low? And now it's, how do we get inflation down? Obviously covering the COVID pandemic and that economic crisis, and now a banking crisis. So, I mean, the economy is constantly changing, and I love that we get to keep learning. I would say the hardest part is maybe when there is a lot, especially like a lot of people talking and trying to keep track of it all, trying to make sense of the message can be a little challenging, even just logistically sometimes if we have to, travel a ton. But I love my job, so I can manage that.
Nick, quick take on both of those.
Yeah, I second everything that Colby and Jonnelle said. That the job has a lot of benefits to it, especially I think for all three of us, we work at institutions where they care a lot about what the Fed is doing, so we never have to justify why we're writing about it. Best part for me is hearing from readers that we've done a good job and they feel like they're getting something and understanding, actually improving their understanding. And the worst part of it, I guess you could say sometimes, we're working all hours. There's, it's not like you can say, well, it's Sunday, I'm with my family. You can't, if you cover the Fed, you have to cover the Fed when the Fed's doing things. But even then, I don't want to sound like I'm complaining about having, you want to have the story, right? You want to cover the big story, but I think we're all maybe a little bit sleep deprived after the March madness of the last week here.
No, well said. The last several years have been remarkable. And I would just add to that, having begun as a teenager in some aspect of this work, and my dad was a newspaper editor, the ability to meet remarkable people, not only celebrities, but remarkable individuals that you wouldn't necessarily know possess a story within them. That has been, I will carry those stories with me for the rest of my days. And I think the worst part is that it's an industry that eats its young, and you have to power through that. And particularly for the young people out there just starting out, if you stick with it, you'll get to that destination, but sometimes it takes a lot of tenacity. Speaking of which, we've got about 8 minutes to go here before we have to wrap things up. I'm going to ask you all sort of go back in time. Did you intend to get into this line of work? How did you get into this beat? How did you find yourself in a position where you were worrying about what the Feds do or regulators are doing over a weekend? How did we get here, as the Talking Heads might have said in a song some years ago? Colby?
Sure. I mean, I'd kind of always been working in, financial news in some capacity. So I was at kind of Bloomberg on the television side before moving over to print journalism. But I'd always, been focused on financial markets. And when I got to the FT, I was focused on kind of government, rates, in particular, the US government bond market. And every rates trader, investor, economist is thinking about the Fed in that regard. So I kind of came at it from a market angle and then backed into kind of the more policy side of the conversation. But it's been nice to have both of those things, and they're quite helpful, especially when there are financial ructions that you have to kind of pay attention to and the Fed is responding to. So knowing how like the plumbing of the financial system works is actually quite helpful in those moments. It's been it's a combination of just like timing and people giving you an opportunity at a certain moment and then kind of running with it as much as you can.
Jonnelle, can you do that in 30 seconds?
I got introduced to the Fed when I was covering personal finance and investing in the bond market. And so for a while now, I've known that I wanted to cover this agency. I was intrigued by the policy, but also just the idea of covering the economy. So to what you said earlier, Mark, I mean, my job has, took me a little while to get to this point, but I love my job. This is my dream job. So for anyone who's out there just trying to figure their way, think about what you want to do, tell people what you want to do, and then try to find ways to do stories that can help you get there. It's all possible.
Life's never a straight line. Nick?
Indeed. I never thought I would have this job. I was a government and history major in college, and my father always bothered me. He was an econ major who worked in in banking, and he thought I should major in econ, and I didn't take any economics classes. And so he's always given me a hard time for that. And now I give him a hard time because I have a job writing about the economy for the Wall Street Journal. So yeah, I've covered a number of different things at the Journal. And I ended up here because I think from those other beats, when my predecessor, who covered the Fed, became my editor, he said, all right, it's time for you to step into this job. And I didn't feel like I could say no. So that's how I ended up doing this.
So we've got probably about, I'm going to say 3.5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask each of you maybe to give essentially a closing thought for the participants, understanding that there are people at all stages of their lives and careers. Whether you think people should be covering business news if they aren't giving it a strong thought. And then finally, just anything that might be on your mind that you think would be a benefit. Now I'll go back to you, Nick.
Sure. So one of the first things I covered at the Journal was the aftermath of the subprime mortgage crisis. And a lot of my reporting unfolded in living rooms of people's homes where they were crying because they were losing their homes. I mean, it became sort of a regular thing where, and it was really hard. I mean, those were really like tough interviews to have to sit there and ask people of all different backgrounds, wealthy people, affluent people, lower income people, like, well, what had happened? And I think that experience impressed on me that, business journalism is really important because people are making extremely important decisions about what to do. And to the extent that we can give them better information to order their lives, whether they're students, retirees, anybody in between, that really matters. That's really important work.
That's great. Colby?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I totally echo what Nick is saying. Also in business kind of news, it has it all. I mean, there's political ramifications, social ramifications, cultural ramifications, and of course, broader financial market considerations too, with some of these decisions. And so if you think that you're kind of having to focus on something quite narrow, it's remarkable how broad actually our beat really is, even though we really primarily cover one institution. It has such a broad scope. And I think that's something that, you don't really realize when you're in college, in grad school, or anything like that, just how far the Fed's reach really is. And so you end up having your hands in all different kinds of stories that you wouldn't even expect, before starting out.
Terrific. And Jonnelle, 30 seconds.
So I used to be I started off covering like Metro News. So when I started covering business, it wasn't immediately obvious in the way that it was when I would cover like a car accident or, someone who died in Iraq and talk to their families like, oh, what's the people impact? But, covering, like Nick said, throughout the economic crisis, you start to see, oh, actually business reporting is really important. It's not just companies making money, but it's the policies that maybe made it possible for these companies to take advantage of other people who might not be that well equipped or that financially savvy, helping people to make those decisions. But I think especially the accountability part, explaining what the policies are that led us to this point and why it's so hard for people to do some of these things that we all want to do.
Thank you all three. I have to tell you, I was really looking forward to this panel, and you all just totally delivered at the most busy time possible. So it's easy, I think, for all of us to see why you are so fabulous at your jobs as you are. And it's great to see behind the curtain, not just on the stage, of all the content realms where you work. So thank you so much. A couple of things I'll mention in closing here. One thing at bankrate.com that we do is present averages on rates that translate as to how the Fed decisions work in the wild. So you can find those rates that are free on the site. And in terms of getting into business news, if you're already there, congratulations. We hope you continue to participate in SABU activities and hope to see you at the next conference or the next webinar. More information on all that, including taking advantage of the early bird registration for the next conference in April in St. Petersburg. You can find that information at sabu.org. So thanks to the SABU staff, as well as my colleague, Matt Goldberg, for putting this together. Thank you and have a good day.